Hello, Arc the Layman here. Here I present a table that shows all possible double, triple, and quadruple stops on the violin under certain circumstances. Whenever we say a fifth, we mean any kind, diminished, augmented, or perfect, doesn't matter. If we say a second, we mean a minor, major, or augmented second. It doesn't matter. Respelling a chord might make it playable. This table shows all possible double, triple, and quadruple stops on the violin, assuming the hands will not stretch so that the fingers will stick to the spanning a fourth, at most, of the length of all the strings. Remember, they are parallel to each other. We call that an allowed spread of a fourth. They can, of course, spread farther, typically, if I'm not mistaken, up to a sixth. In the case of a fifth and a sixth spreads, and theoretically larger than that, a new table can show all the chords that can then be played, but all the chords in the present table will still be possible to play if we allow larger spreads. With the spread of a fifth, an interval of a ninth, for instance, is possible to play on the violin as a double stop, but in this table we are assuming an allowed spread of a fourth, so the ninth is not possible here. We will further explain what we mean by the allowed spread in a later video and present our new tables for larger spreads. In other words, ninths are possible on the violin, but we don't include them in the table. If you want to check if a double stop is possible, a double stop has one interval. Just look at whether or not it appears in the leftmost column of the top or the topmost row. Since we only see a second up to an eighth, those are the possible double stops. Intervals that can be played on a violin as double stops, that is, on two adjacent strings. If you want to know if a triple stop is possible, a triple stop has two intervals. Say whether one can play a second atop another second. Just look whether or not the cell corresponding to the row of the lowest interval and the column of the higher interval length. I'm talking about the lengths. You know, second is the length of the interval. The top, it's the length. The second's the length. Whether or not the cell corresponding to the row of the lowest interval and the column of the higher interval has at least one blue entry. If none are blue, the intervals cannot be played atop each other. Since the second atop a second have an entirely dark cell, no blue, a second atop a second cannot be played on the violin. It doesn't really matter, as we will see, if you start from the top, that is, if you start by checking the row of the bottom interval's length and try to match it with the column of the top interval's length, or if you switch that order. Which is what we did in the first place. It doesn't really matter what order you start. On the other hand, if the cell corresponding to the row and column has at least one blue entry, the chord can be played. So a fifth atop a sixth can be played on the violin since there is some blue in the corresponding cell. But a third cannot be played atop a seventh, or a seventh atop a third on the violin since none of the entries are blue in the table. Of course, we're going to see why that is even true, and if you want to know if a quadruple stop can be played, a quadruple stop contains three intervals. Check the row corresponding to the bottom interval's length and the column corresponding to the second lowest interval's length. Not the second longest, the second interval from the bottom of the chord. Then check if the top interval is in blue in the corresponding cell for that column and row. If so, the chord can be played. For example, a fourth atop a fifth can be played on the violin, and you could go backwards. If one way works, a fifth atop a fourth can also be played. In fact, you can always go backwards. If a third atop a sixth can be played, so can a sixth atop a third. If a fifth atop a fourth atop a third can be played, so can a third atop a fourth atop a fifth, etc. That's a bit like the Pythagoras, the triples, the Pythagorean triples, in mathematics is 3, 4, 5. But anyway, on the other hand, to go back to our earlier example, you cannot add anything atop a third and a seventh. And in fact, you can't have a third atop a seventh or a seventh atop a third, as we just saw it. To begin with, as we saw, we will see in a later video that that's because a third atop a seventh or a seventh atop a third is a ninth. And ninths cannot be played on the outermost of 3 strings on the violin. A 13th cannot be played on the outermost of 4 strings on the violin. Every entry in yellow would result in such a 13th or both a 13th and a 9th. That means if you have, some of those yellow entries don't just produce a 13th, they also produce a 9th with the interval that's stuck to them, but the three intervals together give you a 13th. And every entry in red or pink would result in a 9th played on the two outermost strings among three of the strings on the violin. Of course, before you use a table, you have to do the preliminary checks. You have to see if the lowest note of the chord is the same as or higher than the lowest note and the lowest open string note. We will call them open notes. It's simpler. So the lowest open note for the violin, but they're just notes. They're just notes. It's just that it so happens that those notes can be played on open strings. They don't have to be, but they can be played on open strings. The second lowest note of the chord must be the same as or higher than the second lowest open note. The third lowest note the same as or higher than the lowest note on the violin, etc. The open string notes are, of course, for the violin, of course, G3, D4, A4, and E5. In addition, sometimes a chord will be deemed impossible to play. The table won't include the intervals of the chord, but might still be playable because of an open note within the chord that saves it. The open note is never going to prevent it from being able to be played, but it can help a chord that wouldn't normally be played be possible to play. There is a simple way of deciding whether that is the case. We will explore that in a later video. The first chord here is to be tested, and the second is the open note chord, the open notes chord. The first chord that you see in the picture is the one that we're testing. The second one is the open notes chord, of the G3, the D4, the A4, and the E5. Our chord passes the preliminary testing. You could see that the first note is either the same as or higher than the first note of the open notes chord, etc. The first chord here is to be tested in the second one. Our chord passes the preliminary testing and can be played on the violin since it contains a seventh atop a sixth, which is playable checking our table. You just have to check the table, and that automatically means that a sixth atop a seventh is also playable. In further videos we'll explore how I arrived at these conclusions, and a very simple and straightforward way of determining, without a table, if a chord is playable on the violin-like instrument or the guitar. All with the same method, which should be generalizable to most string instruments with changes of position. Like first position, they talk about frets, like, you're playing on the first fret, the second fret on the guitar, etc. Like those string instruments. I'd be happy to hear from anyone who thinks this is incorrect, especially violin players. I found several wrong entries in the table. I make calculation mistakes. I had to calculate the entries on the table. It's not just true because it's in the table. I calculated the entries and I tried to make sure I didn't make any mistakes. But I made a couple mistakes and I found several wrong entries. So I found several wrong entries in the table. There could still be some. I can make mistakes. And please like, subscribe, and share. And we'll until next time. A side note, I never really determine if it's possible to do 2/5 surrounding some other interval, like fifth, a seventh, a fifth, or a fifth, a sixth, a fifth, and stuff like that, where the fifth is around other intervals, because that would need to be done with 2 fingers, The fifths would need to be done with 2 fingers, and they would have to be placed around the place where that red line is placed on the strings, and something like that. I couldn't draw the actual fingers of a person, or even put it in the correct position of the way people play. But it'd have to be something like that, and I never found an example where they showed a fifth with another interval and another interval. So that's something that I don't know whether it's possible, but Anyways, I said, until next time, and please subscribe and share.